opportunity, it's bad schools, and in the poor districts, it's ghettos. Therefore, even if we say it's not police racism, it must be poverty. And then, of course, what happens is the next logical thing is to say, okay, well, if it's poverty, then we must compare poor black neighborhoods to poor white neighborhoods. And then what happens?
Well, that is not merely a rhetorical question. We find that of all the possible alleged contributors to criminality, lack of education, poverty, divorce rates, illegitimacy rates, none of these has very much independent predictive power. It is the race of the neighborhood that just cuts through all of the chaff, all of the noise, and that is what tells you where there's going to be a lot of crime. And in fact, an argument I frequently make is that it's not so much poverty that causes crime as crime, in effect, causes a great deal of poverty. If there is a criminal neighborhood full of criminal people, people are not going to start businesses there. If you have spent your teens and 20s in and out of jail, chances are, once you reach the magical age of about 40, when people stop committing crimes, if they're still out on the street, you're going to be unemployable. So crime results in poverty in a very, very large degree. Another point I like to make is that during the Depression in the United States, in the end of the 1920s, early 30s, a large number of Americans suddenly became poor. That did not result in a spike in crime, not at all. There was no discernible connection at all. And so, no, that's a fallacious argument, but again, people are never confronted with the facts. And if you do take arrest rates as the best indicators of crime commission rates, and that's the best data we have, aside from the reports of the victims, and as I say, these track almost perfectly in terms of proportions, what we find are some really quite astonishing things. In some of the large cities in the United States, and these are unusual samples in certain respects, because in the large cities you find wealthier whites and often poorer blacks. But you will find differentials in violent crime rates of 30-fold, in some cases 50-fold. In the case of shootings in New York City, and a shooting is when someone fires a weapon in New York City and a bullet hits someone. Blacks are arrested at nearly 100 times the rate of whites. I mean, this is a staggering disproportion. Very seldom in sociology do you get disparities as huge as this. To the point where if New York City were 100% white and all the additional whites were committing crimes the same rates as the whites who are currently living there, you would have a decrease in the murder rate of about 90%. Muggings would drop 85%. Shootings would practically vanish and disappear. You could fire probably 3/4, maybe 80-90% of your police force. And all of these statistics are there, available in the police department's annual report. I would bet you any amount of money the New York Times has never discussed those statistics. As you say, once you open the door, where does it end? Once you determine that perhaps the races are not equivalent, oh my gosh, where does this lead? But to that argument, I point out that we are now building a society based on a complete misperception about race, which leads to all kinds of absurd distortions, inequalities, and all manner of unfairness in the other direction, I think is increasingly intolerable.
Well, I mean, to me, the race relations throughout the West are equivalent to the communist view of why people end up rich and why people end up poor. Because in the communist view, everybody is determined by their economic environment. It's sort of this economic determinism. And therefore, the only reason why some people are rich and some people are poor is the result of exploitation. And therefore, we must equalize everything. And this idea that the only differences in ethnic groups, and particular black and white, we'll talk about some of the other ethnic groups as well, the idea that it's all racism is fundamentally incorrect. And I think where the challenge is that if you start to say, okay, well, it's not racism in the police and it's not poverty, then we get to two places that make people extremely uncomfortable. And one of them is somewhat uncomfortable and the other is thermonuclear uncomfortable. The somewhat uncomfortable one is the question of, is there something self-destructive in black culture? And perhaps it's rage against this supposed edifice of white institutionalized racism, is there something self-destructive in black culture? And there's lots of data to support that, insofar as black families, for instance, were doing much better in the 1950s, when we could argue that racism was far higher. A, is there something destructive in the black culture? And B, is there something biologically different between the races? And those two areas are such staggering landmines for people that it's a truth test, like in the old days in the medieval court system. If you were accused of a crime, one of the ways you could prove your innocence was to reach into a boiling vat of water and pull out an iron rod. And there are actually some vaguely decent reasons for that, because only innocent people would assume that God would protect them from such a burning. But that's the truth test for me, for intellectual integrity with regards to this. And one that I failed myself for many years, so I say this with all humility, is that can you reach in and even begin to entertain the idea of either a dysfunctional black culture and the question of racial differences that are biologically rooted?
Yes, that is, as you say, the thermonuclear question. I tend to call it the radioactive question. Yes, indeed. That is the road down which very, very few minds are prepared to venture, no matter what the data. And as a matter of fact, I was just reading an article by a fellow Kaufman, I believe his name is. He has investigated the extent into which scientists in the psychometric and psychological testing area have decided not to investigate this question, or if they do investigate it, frankly, to lie about it, because it is more important to promote lies about racial differences. In other words, to minimize them, to pretend they do not exist, rather than recognize them. I've always taken a different view on that. After all, if we posit as an irrefutable and unarguable fact that white people and black people are, from a mentality point of view, absolutely identically the same, and then we tell black people, all right, the reason you do not do so well in school is because of racist teachers. The reason you don't do well economically is because of racist employers. The reason you're in jail is because of those racist police. Everything that goes wrong for you, past, present, and future, is the fault of these wicked white people. What better way to teach black people to hate white people? That's, in fact, the message that we give black people day in, day out. And in fact, it's a way of almost infantilizing blacks. It's telling them nothing is really your fault. I think in a way that is as bad a message as inciting them to hate whites, because when you think about it, as we grow up, all of us eventually reconcile ourselves to the fact that we are not the smartest, the best looking, the most musical, the most attractive to the opposite sex. There's always somebody who, in a fair fight, is going to beat us. And if we keep telling black people, no, you've always been cheated, we never give them a chance to grow up. Furthermore, up until maybe 60 or 70 years ago, the idea that the races were unequal in average was taken for granted. And that didn't result in the kinds of horrible despair or the kind of violence that people predict now if you were ever to make something acknowledge publicly that there are racial differences. As you said, in the 1950s, in fact, from the 1920s on, at least since even under slavery, for heaven's sake, there were more stable families among blacks than there are today. So what is and of course, at that time, the idea that blacks were mentally not comparable to whites was utterly taken for granted. So I don't think that we risk some sort of psychological or social upheaval if we recognize the truth. On the contrary, by failing to recognize the truth, we build in all sorts of absurdities into our society. If you can't tell the truth about racial ability and racial groups, you can hardly tell the truth about anything else.
Okay, so let's dig into some of those differences for those people who, I guess, are in the mainstream and have had all of this information, like Moses striding through the Red Sea. All of this information has been kept from people. Some of the basics, of which I've talked about with other experts in the field on this show. We'll put a playlist to ethnicities and intelligence, ethnicities and IQ below. But to me, the most important one is IQ. And yes. Of course, people are alarmed about talking about this because Dr. Jason Richwine had a career until, like, he now has a career, but it's a different kind of career until he pointed out that Hispanics have lower IQs than whites. One of the greatest biologists in the 20th century, James Watson, co-discoverer with Crick of the structure of DNA. Well, he mentioned something about this and was forced out of his career and had to end up selling his Nobel Prize for food. So it is a very, very challenging position, but nonetheless, we must gird our loins and press onward, as is the case with all honest intellectual inquiries. But the data seems to be fairly conclusive that sub-Saharan African blacks have an IQ that is an average of 70, which is 2 standard deviations below the average for white Western Europeans and whites in North America. And that American blacks, because of a 20 to 25% admixture of European DNA, have an IQ between sub-Saharan Africans and Europeans clocking in at about 85. And from what I understand of the data, if you normalize by IQ, the vast majority of racial differences disappear. In other words, we're not comparing apples to apples if we're comparing blacks to whites in America. What we want to do is compare blacks who have an IQ of 85 with whites who have an IQ of 85, and we find similar levels of dysfunction and criminality and single parenthood and so on. However, arguably, and I think very strongly arguably, the situation for American blacks has gotten a lot worse since they were co-opted by sort of semi-socialist political correctness and absolved of responsibility to a large degree. Insofar as in the post-war period in America, a lot of blacks were emerging from poverty, a lot of them were moving into higher education, a lot of blacks were getting professional degrees and so on. And now that this giant cloak of insurmountable white racism between you and any success factors has occurred, I think a lot of the really able and competent blacks have been blocked culturally from success, because of course all successful blacks counter the narrative of insurmountable white racism and therefore become an enemy to this very prevalent idea in both leftists and in certain sections of the black community, to the enormous tragedy of race relations, in my opinion.
Well, 2 points there. First of all, even when you do control for IQ, there are residual differences. And these can perhaps be attributed to differences in the willingness to forego present satisfaction for future gain. There seems to be an independent variable along those lines as well. Blacks have, I never can remember whether there's a greater or lesser time, how that works out according to the lingo. But
less capacity to defer gratification, I think, is probably the easiest way to put it, because yes. I have that problem too.
Yes, yes. They're less able to sacrifice now for future benefit. And this is found from childhood on, and even when you control for IQ. But I agree with you, IQ is really the fundamental differential. And interestingly enough, all of the tests which have been accused of grievous bias, systematic bias against blacks because they were invented by white people, well, lo and behold, North Asians score higher on them than whites. And the way we find North Asians living in terms of illegitimacy rates, per capita income, crime rates, in all of those respects, they build societies that are frankly objectively superior to those of whites, which does not necessarily mean that we wish to turn Japanese or be replaced by Japanese or Koreans. But along those standards, they are different and they can be described as superior to us. The other question you raised is the extent to which the success of individual blacks refutes the idea of monolithic racism. It doesn't seem to make a bit of difference. We can have a black president of the United States, a black attorney general. We can have all of these black movie stars and basketball players. It doesn't make a bit of difference. Every one of them is either some sort of freak exception, or they would claim they'd have gotten even further had they been white. I remember years ago, the president of the NAACP, at that time, I've forgotten his name now. This is perhaps 20 years ago. He was saying, okay, I've done pretty well. I'm president of the NAACP. If I were white, I'd be president of the United States. Well, of course, now we have a black man who's president of the United States. How far could he have gone without racism? I mean, obviously, he too had to combat racism daily. He was this wonderful, productive guy who had to be twice as good to get half as far, as the expression goes. what could he have accomplished if he were not this spat upon color? But in any case, no. The fact individual success stories never seem to go very far to refute this monolithic racism that all blacks face, and at the same time, oddly enough, the exceptional achievement of a certain non-white group, namely Asians, in the United States or in any multiracial society, that too never refutes this theory of monolithic white racial exploitation either.
But that's never spoken of, and I've talked about it this show about the invisible North Asians.
Yeah.
They're ghosts. They don't exist. Because whenever people, I had a guy call in some months ago. He wanted to talk about racism in America. And I said, oh, do you mean like Hispanic racism towards blacks or Puerto Rican racism towards X group? And he's like, no, I know you know what I'm talking about, because it's always and forever portrayed when you speak of racism, it can only and forever be whites against blacks. Now, the question, of course, is, if you start to factor in the North Asians, and by that we mean, I assume you mean the Chinese, Koreans, and the Japanese and so on, who score on IQ tests that are supposedly so Euro and white-centric, who score higher than whites by up to half a standard deviation at times. So the question then becomes, if you bring the Japanese, say, into the equation, and Japanese have a higher per capita income than whites. They have greater family stability. They achieve greater educational levels in general, and they exhibit all the same factors of a higher IQ group that you would imagine. In other words, if you took the whites who have the same IQs as the average of the North Asians, they're doing about the same. Yes. Then if you bring the North Asians into the equation, what happens is the monolithic white racism cracks and falls, and then we say, well, whites must be somehow pro-North Asian because they're doing better, but they must be anti-black. So it can't be just general otherness that white people have a problem with. It must be more specific to the black community. And again, that's just dominoes, and people are experts at preventing these first, they hang on like grim death to make sure this first domino never goes down. Because then you have to say, okay, well, if whites aren't racist because North Asians do better in white societies than blacks, then maybe we should look and see if there are differences in behavior between North Asians and blacks. And again, that just leads you down this domino path when you start looking at the statistics. As you point out in The Color of Crime, North Asians, which have of course been called the model minority, commit crimes at significantly lower rates than whites. And therefore, we would expect them to be judged. So if people are judging the behaviors of groups rather than just having some innate prejudice, we have a problem, because then not all white negative views towards blacks can be blamed on mere white racism, because the moment empiricism drifts into this, we have to start talking about facts rather than prejudices.
Yes, that's certainly true. American society operates according to a very simple syllogism. All groups are, by definition, equal. Some groups do not succeed at the same rate as other groups. Ergo, every one of those differences must be the result of systematic oppression by the majority group. Now, as you point out, Asians end up having to be ghosts in order for that to hold true. And yes, this exceptional success story of Asians is never part of that question.
Now, let's talk a little bit about one of the hottest topics at the moment, if not the hottest topic, which is the question of Hispanics. Because with Donald Trump's ascendancy, and to people who don't have access to this information, and by that I generally mean indoctrinated leftists, people who don't have this information find the rise, the meteoric rise of Donald Trump to be absolutely incomprehensible. But of course, you've done in The Color of Crime and a lot of your other work, you've done a lot of work on helping people to understand some of the challenges of the mass Hispanic migration into America and its effects on criminality, on the school system, on bullying, on school violence, on neighborhoods and so on. So for people who don't live in all white gated communities, which seems sometimes to be the majority of leftists, can you help people understand one of the reasons why Donald Trump is becoming so successful when he talks about Hispanic crime or immigrant crime, illegal immigrant crime in particular?
I think that there are really two important reasons for Donald Trump's success. And even if he's not even if he doesn't become president of the United States, he will have achieved something absolutely remarkable that will go down in history. It will be downplayed, but it will be extremely significant. And that is, he is the first candidate in, perhaps half a century to talk about immigration in terms of the interests of the American people. This is unprecedented. Mostly, when we talk about immigration, we assume that it's a wonderful thing for America, no matter where anyone comes from, no matter how ill-educated, no matter how crime-prone, no matter how failed the society from which he issues. It's all wonderful for America because diversity itself is a wonderful thing. And so, for the people who actually live with the consequences of diversity, they see that when their primary school is filled with people for whom the teachers have to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to teach them English, how to speak English rather than mathematics or history, they realize that's not an advantage. When they are living next to people who play mariachi music at 4 a.m. in the morning, who keep chickens that crow at 3 a.m., when they want to go and play on the baseball field, but they find that it's taken over by Hispanics who are playing soccer. All of this kind of oil and water sense of being invaded by a foreign country, people don't like it. They don't like it, and it's perfectly normal that they not like it. And by the way, it's not just whites who don't like it. Ask some of the blacks who have left South Central Los Angeles what it's like to be invaded by Hispanics. They don't care for it one bit either. So we have a presidential candidate who's speaking in terms of the undesirability of certain immigrants. And their undesirability to speak in those terms implicitly is to say, we need immigrants who will fit into the United States and contribute to our country. That is an obviously sensible approach to immigration, but it's unprecedented in the last, 4 or 5 decades in terms of any kind of prominent presidential candidate or congressman or senator. So this is so refreshing to ordinary white people who are sick and tired of pressing one to listen to be connected to someone who actually speaks English. They don't wish to have this choice of speaking to someone in Spanish. The other thing that I think that Donald Trump has done, and this is something that the so-called far right in Europe has done very well, is to combine a sense of racial or cultural nationalism with a sense of socialism, if you will. Ordinary Americans do not hate government. They hate government when it seems to be coddling blacks and immigrants and criminals and the sexually incomprehensible and all of these people have a chip on their shoulder against white America. They do not like that kind of government. But in terms of Social Security, in terms of medical help for those who cannot afford it, a kind of a safety net, most white Americans are not upset about that. They don't take this narrow libertarian view that the conservatives so wish to promote. And so he's appealing both to a kind of socialistic aspect that many people have, as well as a nationalist sense. That would be the kind of appeal we find in the Vlaams Belang in Belgium, the Flemish nationalists. We would find that in the French National Front. We find that also in some of the Austrian parties. This has been very successful in Europe. And so Donald Trump, whether consciously or not, I think in his case, simply instinctively, he is combining the aspects of nationalism, national identity, with the sense of socialism, which is government is supposed to be helping look after people who can't look after themselves. And that's been extremely, extremely successful. We'll see whether it carries him all the way to the presidency.
I believe that it will, but we'll see that time will tell. This is something that's hard for people to understand. First of all, of course, they say, well, America is a nation of immigrants, and that's true to some degree. But the vast majority of American immigrants up until 1965 were significant majority white Europeans. Same Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman culture for the most part. Lots of regional differences. Nobody's going to conflate somebody from the Basque region with somebody from Poland. But nonetheless, races blend, and people from various ethnicities, people from various nations within the same race usually end up being fairly indistinguishable over the course of, say, 2 to 3 generations after the first generation cultural effects wear off. We generally model ourselves after our peers rather than after our parents, which is why people with a strong Scottish accent raise kids who don't have a strong Scottish accent, because even though the parents teach the kid how to speak, they don't end up with a brogue because they're modeling themselves after their peers. But the racists don't seem to go that way. It seems very hard for people to move beyond the question of race. Now, whether that's innate and biological, or as you've pointed out, one of the great biologists has pointed out that two subspecies of the same species never inhabit the same geographical area for very long. There's always a sort of fight for dominance. But since 1965, the idea of European immigration, that America was a white Christian European derived nation, has been completely cast by the wayside. And now the vast majority of immigrants are coming in who are not white and not European and come from cultures that are antithetical to the entire American experiment. And my argument very briefly has been that after Khrushchev pointed out the endless crimes and brutalities of Joseph Stalin, the idea that communism was, or leftism was, some wonderful utopia which had been sustained by the left since the founding of communist Russia in 1917. Well, the evidence was in, and it was a nightmare, and so they couldn't win the intellectual or fact-based argument anymore. So they just started importing groups who vote wildly for Democrats. Muslims vote wildly for Democrats. Hispanics vote wildly for Democrats. Third world groups of every race vote wildly for Democrats. So they've got their thumb on the scale. They don't want to engage in an intellectual debate because the facts aren't on their side. So they're stacking the deck by bringing in people who are going to vote for them. And the fact that third worlders in general vote for the left should give everyone somewhat of a pause when it comes to examining the left. But I think that aspect to say not all immigrants are created equal. And the last thing, I don't really make a speech here. The last thing I'll mention is that it's not America plus immigrants. It's America minus whites plus immigrants. That's the important thing, and this is particularly true in Europe. As immigration goes up, the birth rate of the whites goes down. Now, I mean, correlation is not causation and so on, but given that most immigrants require a huge amount of government resources, and those resources have to come from somewhere, when you get low-functioning, low IQ, largely illiterate, at least in the ways of the West, immigrants coming in, you have a massive wealth transfer from whites and blacks who are native to immigrants, which means that there's less money available for whites and blacks who are native to raise their own kids. So what you do is you end up with very fertile third world immigrants coming into a country, taking away resources by which the natives might have their own children. So it is a escalating displacement, which is what we can see happening in Europe. And that is demographically a disaster in the long run. Sorry for the long speech. If you can extract a question from that, I'd be perfectly thrilled, or just a comment.
No. I agree with you 100%. As you well know, the United States up until 1965 had an immigration policy that was designed to keep the country overwhelmingly Northern European. In fact, the very first naturalization law passed in 1790 by the very first Congress of the United States. This is when the new country was deciding, well, what sort of country do we wish to be? They established a naturalization law that required that every candidate for naturalization be a free white person of good character. They had a very clear notion. This is going to be a nation for white people. And in 1965, when the law was changed, the people who were boosting that law, as you probably know, promised that this was not going to result in any kind of upset in the ethnic balance. Oh, no. Now, we don't know if they were fools, or whether they were liars, but they were one or the other. In any case, there has been a huge upset. And if in 1965 the Congress had been told, well, in less than 100 years, in probably about 80 years, this change in immigration means that whites will become a numerical minority in the United States, we can be absolutely certain that law would never have been passed. Americans simply took it for granted that they were an outpost of Europe. And that is why people who have grown up in an outpost of Europe, when they find that their neighborhood has become an outpost of Haiti or Guatemala or Mexico, they are absolutely infuriated. And because they haven't had an opportunity to vote for Donald Trump before, at the very least, they will move to some other part of the United States that is still an outpost of Europe. So yes, this demographic change, combined, as you say, with declining birth rates, really spells a remarkable and transformative change in the entire texture of life in the United States. And I agree with you. I think that the declining birth rates in both Europe and the United States among whites have, at least in part, are due to this transfer of wealth that you just described. At the same time, I think there is some kind of psychological barrier to whites. When they look out and they see the changing of their country, they see their country slipping from their fingers. I think that at some deep psychological level, that makes them think, well, gosh, I'm not sure how many young descendants of mine I wish to send in to this future America where they will be a minority and perhaps even a hated minority. I think that there is I can't prove this, but I think that there's probably some kind of psychological effect there as well that depresses white fertility rates. But who knows? I mean, we find the same kind of depressed fertility in places like Japan or Korea, Taiwan, where they don't have that transforming effect either of demography. But in any case, yes, what we're facing is oblivion ultimately if this continues at its current pace.
Well, and the degree to which white culture has benefited the world, and of course, white culture is a very, very wide net. But if you sort of look at the inventions and the art and the music and the political, the philosophy, of course, came out of white culture in ancient Greece as a whole. The scientific method, the free market, a lot of the inventions that have come out of the free market. The funny thing is that if white people really cared about the world, they would very much wish to preserve white culture.